Hello, everybody. Hello and welcome. My name is Juan Cruz. I'm the Dean of the School of Fine Art here at the Royal College of Art. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to our Visual Cultures lecture series. Introducing today Georgios Kontis, who will be introducing and speaking with Gilane Tawadros and Luke Tuymans. Georgios will introduce our speakers a bit later and talk about the themes of the evening. I just want to say something about the Visual Culture lecture series very briefly, why we do it and what it means to us. The Visual Culture lecture series really is an opportunity and a challenge for us to think publicly as a School of Fine Art about matters that interest us. So it challenges us first to think internally about what we're interested in, what we think it's important to talk about, and then it gives us the opportunity and also challenges us to think about what people we might like help from in talking and thinking about these questions. And we're fortunate at the Royal College of Art in the sense that we can bring, we feel, the best people in the world that we think can help us talk and think about the issues that we care about. We started out doing these talks as single presentations, single talks by people, but quickly moved towards thinking about the conversation as being a more effective method of research or inquiry. It seems that a conversation generates things that maybe people wouldn't have even predicted in advance that they might say. And so we favour this model of inviting people to present something and then maybe be challenged to discuss the thing that they're talking about in relation to someone else, because we feel this is quite an interesting way of maybe generating new ideas and new thoughts about these things. We also like to involve, as I said, it's a public event, but it's a way it expresses the thinking that happens within the school, and we're very interested in involving people from within the school in selecting, identifying the issues, identifying the people we want to talk, and also then hosting the discussions. And in this case today, I'm very happy to introduce Georgios Kontis, who is a PhD student now at the Royal College of Art, who will be introducing the session and then introducing the speakers and hosting the conversation. The work of Georgios Kontis focuses on abstract painting and on its function as an image. It becomes a contemplation on the autonomy the painted image gains, triggering questions on authenticity and the artistic agency. Georgios studied at the Athens School of Fine Arts, at the Academy of Visual Arts in Munich, and at the University of Arts in Berlin, and he holds an MFA from St. Just Academy in Breda, the Netherlands. He's currently doing a practice-based PhD in painting here at the Royal College of Art on the notion of authenticity, which is one of the key things that we want to discuss this evening. Recent shows include O Kunstbureau in Vienna with Just Quist, The Same Sky, Leipzig Art Foundation, Düsseldorf, Tender as the Night, Can Gallery Athens, Abstractions, Hellenic American Union Athens, Eurocontrol Premises in Brussels, Let Go Project, Ruimte Cezu in Middelburg, Young Masters, Glassenhuis Lommel in Belgium. He's spoken also publicly at the Rijksacademie Open Studios in Amsterdam with Camille van Winkel, Authenticity in the Act of Painting Symposium, De Pont Museum Tilburg, Memory and Perception, Technique Conference, Rich Mix London, The Threatening Image, Student Union, Royal College of Art, London. So I'd like you please to join me in welcoming Georgios Kontis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juan, for the introduction. Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here. I would say that the discussion today is quite challenging, as the ambition is to try to have a look at the link between the two spheres, the one of the individual and the end of the social, and how these two correlate and intertwine, taking in consideration the current sociological and political circumstances, and by trying to make a link to the notion of authenticity. I will begin with a short introduction. I have been recently thinking about Antigone, the theatrical play of Sophocles from the ancient Greek era. In Antigone, the homonymous character, one of the protagonists of the play, has a dispute with the king and defies his authority. She defies his authority with an act that eventually led to her own death, but has an act, though, that has become an emblematic act of resistance. I am particularly interested in the play because of the way the dialogue unfolds and the arguments take place, and also in the way the chorus that represents common sense and public opinion reacts to that, highlighting a whole construction of debating and of this construction of the dialogue. And through that, we gain an insight into the society of that time, and particularly in how a citizen was regarded in it, at the beginning of what is regarded to be a liberal and democratic form of it. A citizen in it as an emancipated form, having an emancipated form, or a free individual in this first instance of a democratic society, without which the paradigm shift in art that this photo signifies would have not been possible. The argument here is the basic one, that the artist is inextricably connected to his or her time, that he is more influenced by it to the point he is called a child of his or her era. The sociological and political conditions, as well as tradition and the cultural context, become very important factors in this relationship, since they both provide the artist with knowledge, as well as with a designated field within which he can act. Yet the question which follows that is up to which point this influence takes place, and whether what we perceive as a free individual or an emancipated artist is basically a construction of these conditions. This seems to eventually question any idea of a sovereign, authentic self, as how can I claim that I am an individual with free will when I seem to be a construction of the conditions that surround me? Heidegger uses the wordplay they self in this regard, with which he explains that the self, through its exposure in relation to the they, becomes they self. In this way, the iconic figure of the Caspar David Friedrich painting, the Wanderer, who is placed at the center of his world, becomes somehow dislocated from this center, as its sovereignty seems to become questioned. What seems to take place instead is a mosaic of different constituents, like this small beautiful painting of Francis Alice. I saw it last summer at David Svirner Gallery. A multitude of different elements. So instead of having this seemingly sovereign self, there is a multitude of different elements that concludes to the forming of the self, and seems to question and challenge any idea of authenticity. Yet, what is authenticity? What is this complex notion? I think it's worth having a look at it. Authenticity is a charged notion, seemingly obsolete, and surrounded often by myths and misconceptions. It has been linked with a pursuit for an absolute truth, a search for spirituality or for God. It has been even linked with totalitarianism. Adorno, for instance, criticizes Heidegger that he uses authenticity in a way similar to the rhetoric of the Third Reich. Even the link between authenticity and the handmade object seems to be rather simplistic and misleading. Authenticity becomes rather a matter on what the making of art can be, and whether the artist is someone in charge of his own acts, besides any simplistic allegation on the handmade object. It is a matter of whether one acts on his own authority. I'm using the male for this, of course, the female as well. Something that also stems from the etymology of the word. Authenticity becomes also a matter of how one deals with the non-existence of any tabula rasa. The tabula rasa is the blank slate upon which nothing exists, and a positioning towards and a handling of what pre-exists. It becomes a matter regarding the inevitable of repetition and the inability to create something afresh, and how can something new be created out of it? How can I make something new out of something that has a sense of repetition in it? Well, a simple example for that can be the use of the ready-made. If we think, for instance, of the Coca-Cola bottle of Cille de Meyrières or Marcel Duchamp's fountain, the urinal is just an industrial copy, but Duchamp's fountain is an authentic, is a work of art. It's something you made out of it. Yet there's a change of state there and the creation of something new without basically any physical acts on it. It's just with a change of context that the new is created. To get back to the Francis Alice painting, if I would try to make an equivalent mapping of my surroundings, that would include the current sociological and political conditions, where so-called post-Fordism and flexible working, along with neoliberalism and the doctrines of the free market, create an environment in which everything becomes translated into financial terms and is expected to be efficiently productive. Art institutions and even art schools are now being asked to produce numbers as commercial businesses and to follow a model that seems to suppress their sovereignty and autonomy. And this applies also to the everyday life and function of the artist. Through the entrepreneurial role he is often asked to play, a canon through which everything seems to be seen, and a canon through which everything seems to be seen in an environment in which the making of art becomes a rather insignificant activity, regarded as leisure or as non-productive time. And that seems to be intensified in the recent years of the crisis and the turbulences that follow this. What seems to take place is a struggle, an individual logos to be uttered, which is a personal voice to be found, when there is the feeling that there is a language implemented on the artistic language, a language from a business or financial world implemented on my endeavor to find my personal language, a multi-layered hindrance that demands to be the center of my attention, condemning functions as daydreaming to be wasted time. Well, it is a very challenging. It's very challenging to question how the cultural identity can be seen in this state of flux, as well as how can the notion of authenticity be addressed within it. It's quite complex matters. I'm very excited and honored to share this talk with our two exceptional guests, Gilane Tawadros and Luke Tuymans. Luke Tuymans will speak first. I will read a short CV. Widely credited with having contributed to the revival of painting in the 1990s, Belgian artist Luke Tuymans continues to assert its relevance by addressing a diverse range of topics. Quiet, restrained, and at times unsettling, his works engage equally with questions of history and its representation, as with quotidian subject matter, cast in unfamiliar and eerie lights, painted from pre-existing imagery, and often appears slightly out of focus and sparsely colored, like third-degree abstractions from reality, whereas earlier works were based on magazine pictures, drawings, television footage, and Polaroids. Recent source images include material accessed online and the artist's own iPhone photos, printed out and sometimes rephotographed several times. Born in 1958 in Mortsel near Antwerp, Tuymans was one of the first artists to be represented by David Zwirner. Since joining the gallery in 1994, he has had 12 solo exhibitions with David Zwirner. Glasses, a solo museum exhibition featuring a selection of portraits by Luke Tuymans, was recently on view at Museum aan de Stroom in Antwerp. a portion of the presentation traveled to the National Portrait Gallery in London. In the fall of 2016, the artist's work was presented in a sole exhibition at Lille Métropole, Musée d'Art Moderne, d'Art Contemporain and d'Arts Bruts in Villeneuve d'Ascq in France, as well as the 9th Biennale de Montreal. It's a list, it's an ongoing list. Just to say, it's about 130 solo shows, 750 group shows, 70 monographies. Please welcome Luc Tuymans.
Because I'm pretty done with that. Okay. Yeah, no, but we should we, can we do it bigger? Just deal yeah.
Slideshow is
Just put the slide on. Just well, anyway. Oh. Yes. Yeah. Fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you, Georgios. What I'm going to do is I've actually been doing this for the last 2 weeks, lectures and meetings, and I will talk about a couple of things. I try to be very fast, because there's a lot of things are going on. Also to the end of your text, Georgios, where you have this sort of, it's quite a little bit depressing, but I think it's still important to go on in a sense. What I'm going to show you first is actually 3 or 4 paintings that were actually, which I made before I even showed them, and showed them much later, and especially in the gallery. So they're works that are dealing with the idea of memory, history in a sense also, and a sort of assessment of the real, because I started out as a painter that worked very gestural with a lot of colors and abstracted imagery. And I stopped doing that since I didn't want to make art derived from art, because I don't think that's really interesting. I wanted to derive art from something that is real. I also come out of that region and out of that context, basically. And I chose something that was a sort of close history, which was actually would be the building block onto which I would build some kind of an oeuvre that, as an undercurrent, has the idea of violence in combination with tenderness. So the first example you see is a doll that I used to play with as a kid, which I still own, which you can open up with a zipper. It's made out of cloth. And I deliberately barged out the head, and also it has no genitals, so it has no gender in a sense also. And the zipper, which you can open it and stuff it and make it come alive, is actually sort of a replacement of the face in a sense. It's anonymizing of an object. I painted it deliberately with a certain medium underneath so that it would prematurely crack, so that you had like the 2 elements, cloth and porcelain, in a sense. Second image is it's a deliberate image and a very ambiguous image, and probably one of the most difficult paintings I actually ever painted or will ever paint. It is based upon a watercolor that I made in Dachau, where you have a gas chamber, which is not a replica. And it was laying on, because we're also going to talk about authenticity, and there's also an element of ethics, of course. It was laying on my studio floor for a very, very long time, so the paper yellowed. I then decided, years later, to paint it on a frame which is also not straight. It's a crooked frame, if you can see that. So the whole idea of the document was implemented into the painting, derived from this watercolor. Without the title, this would just be a basement. But with the title, which is Gas Chamber, it becomes something completely different. So it's a very conceptual painting, in a sense. It also deals with a very deliberate taboo. The one I painted before that was this one, Our New Quarters, based upon a postcard which was actually sent by Alfred Cantor, who was an inmate of the Theresienstadt, which by no means was a death camp. It was a camp from which they were sent to death camps. The people were assembled in this camp. He survived 2 other camps and was reassembled after being freed by the Russians in the same camp, which is Theresienstadt. and he just stole a cardboard box of these postcards, the postcards depicting the casemate, which is a military building. And years later, he started a book, which is not a diary, but he started to make a book with drawings, which is a very interesting and very poignant sort of testimony. Before doing that, though, he glued this postcard, this image, into the beginning of the book and wrote underneath. By then he was living in the States. In 1970, he wrote on Our New Quarters, whereas in Czech he wrote that in the beginning when he was staying there to send it to his family, as if nothing has changed, which is an interesting point, I think, the element of inbuilt. When I painted it, this was an element of taboo because I don't have that experience. But I wanted to break through that taboo just because of it. I mean, Adorno was mentioned in terms of the fact that actually poetry was no longer a possibility after the Second World War, which of course is true and is not true to a point. There is the famous poet, and the name doesn't fall in now, who wrote the Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland. The name will fall in a minute. Everybody will know that poem, which was the sort of answer to Adorno. So what I did is using a military color, non-color, and then it was not finished. So what I used is I wrote the text on it. The text becomes part of it, and it's sort of yellowish mixed with white, so it sort of makes like a subtitle to a point. The other one is also derived from this place called Schwarzheide, which was a labor camp, in which actually there was a sort of blockhouse that's remained, where you could see like all these drawings that were incomplete. The detainees, out of fear of being caught, they actually tore them up and then distributed them. So at the end of the war, and the images that survived were incomplete. I took with me the surroundings, which is actually these trees, put a canvas into the sunlight, a grounded canvas until it yellowed naturally, then very fast painted these trees on it and the lines that symbolize what I just said. Then we go to another situation, which I just did and just opened like a week ago, which is a place that a student that I got to know 25 years ago in the St. Lucas in Brussels. There was a sort of, it was sculpture and installation art that they gave there. And I met him 25 years ago, and he's with 15 other students, and he just took over the entire space. We became friends. He is now an artist in his own right. And what he actually did is something interesting, because it's about the idea of about the local and the glocal nearly. He actually did this. He actually rebuilt the house of his grandmother and displaced it with 5 centimeters. And then he made a sculpture out of it, in which there is an exhibition space, a residency for artists, and he wanted me to be the very first show there. It's in the middle of fucking nowhere. But this, of course, amplifies the idea that you can derive art and you can actually make art from everywhere. The point is also that there is another nutcase like Dr. Professor Wessler, who started in the 60s a small little like nearly a shop window place called the Kunstkabinet in Bremerhaven, where you showed Richter, where you showed Blinky Palermo, and by now it is like a mythological place in a sense. So that by now there's also in Bremerhaven a museum of contemporary art, and there is also a Kunsthalle. So this is also a project that is derived from one person that opens it up. It's also the idea how an artist shows how you can actually sort of like react towards an art world that has gone in several ways corporate. And I think therefore it was quite meaningful to do that. So what I did is, on the facade you see the shadows of the windows that are bricked up. I made with chalk the shadows on it so that they would be sort of permanent for the duration of the show. Then there were 5 lithographies which I actually reproduced on the windows outside of the building, which you can also see from the inside so that you can have the light coming in. These plates are actually plates of which I made lithos that are actually the ones I eat from, and they come from Croatia. They come from 1920. And of course, after the communist system collapsed, the whole production collapsed also. I also made wall paintings of these situations in the very first circular sort of art center, which was in the middle of Zagreb. And of course, I made a whole body of this type of wall paintings that are ephemerical, because after the show they disappear. They're sometimes made just practically because we cannot get hold of the work, or the insurance value is too high, and then still want to have the image. But I also find it interesting that it's a sort of ephemerical, of course it's documented, sort of oeuvre that is like a sort of shadow of what I do. And then you have the space upstairs, and then I'm going to show you the paintings that were at that time in Hong Kong. This is based from a projected image on a doll. It's called 2017, seeing the times we're living in. This is a painting which is quite large, a bit less large than you see it here, taking from publicity, because I was always fascinated by publicity, because it has to do with hygiene, beauty, and it also is in some sort of way nonsensical, and it is actually very poor when it comes to emotions. Then I show you the other image, which was called The Swamp, which is a very recent image. It's a person who is at the point or at the verge of dying. This image I used to use upstairs on the floor, painted there temporarily for that show, in collision with the green of the outskirts of where the building is built, which gives it a sort of threatening element that I found quite interesting, together with the domesticity of the plates downstairs. Then, another thing that's going on as we speak is a show called The Absent Museum. It's a show that is made by the director, Dirk Snauwaard, and who's also the curator of this show. And it's quite a poignant show, because it's a show that points out a couple of difficulties in Brussels itself. It was opened during the 2 art fairs that were going there. There was also a colloquium I was asked for all the people from all the museums. Of course, we are in a very urgent situation when it comes to Europe. I mean, I woke up with Brexit and Nigel Farage when it happened here in London, which is insane. And I also then, for the last 8 years, I worked with the European Commission. We were asked by Barroso, when he was still heading it, together with Rem Koolhaas, Georgi Conrad, Pistoletta, and many more people, to come up with a new narrative for Europe. Because I also see that there you have the word cultural ID, Europe, and authenticity. And after 80 meetings and about 15 foundations that were founded, I sort of had enough. There was an idea that was uttered to actually displace the Documenta to Brussels, because Brussels is still the capital of Europe. It would be much more sense to do it there. But by 2 weeks ago, the situation, that the idea of a show became obsolete, and I thought it was very urgent to gather 1.5 weeks ago in the Palais de Beaux-Arts in Brussels, about 45 people from the arts, science, and academics, to actually make a mission statement for Europe and culture, which will come out this week. It will be translated in 25 languages, and it will also be advertised in newspapers, also the New York Times. I mean, it will be go the world round. But this particular show of Dirk Snauwaard was interesting also because in Brussels, for the last 15 to 20 years, we don't have a museum of modern and contemporary art. This because of a political dispute, which means that the federal collection, especially of contemporary art, which means work of Marcel Broodhaas, my work, if I want to lend it, I can't even get hold of it. And there is an empty shell now, which is the Citroën garage, to which when asked actually Bernard Blistin, who is heading actually Pompidou, to fill that up. So this is all going on in just one little city. Also, when we were talking about Europe, and you think about Europe, you think about cities, which is quite interesting. Also, if you see how people vote, you can see how they vote in accordance to their urban setting, the rural setting. All those things are quite, I mean, of course, it's quite self-evident. They're practically medieval. But it's interesting that we are coming back to this sort of social fiber and structure. And just on a small place, and Belgium is very small, there is a great deal of possibilities and potentials. What I showed in this show was actually 4 paintings, and I'm going to show you them one after the other. This is 3 paintings of one space. It was the biggest space of a show I did in 2015 in Qatar. under the mount of Shaikha Mayasha. The show was called Intolerance, and of course was very problematic since the political situation, since the fact that these people are behind every attack you can think of. But therefore, I just wanted to do it because I think that is an interesting point. The biggest space was a circular round space, and I was there when we were taking the show down, and they had made in casings for the paintings, and I had it painted in a sort of night blue. And I thought that was quite an interesting metaphor to paint this space totally empty, and of course for the absent museum it couldn't have been better. So there's the second one, and the third one, and then there's another one which that's in the space. And then there's another one which is actually about the presence of a figure which is behind a bush, in a sense. Good. Yeah, this is still some more images. This is the one that was in the historical part. It's actually a painting of Speer, which I actually then turned out to more like a mannequin-like figure, a doll figure with closed eyes, and it's called Secrets. The only thing that sort of gives it away is the rim of the uniform and the brown suit that sort of gives this sort of element of a date or an era. Yeah, okay. Then the thing I'm working on right now, which is sanguine, which means bloedrood in Flemish. The city has asked me, the city of Antwerp, to do a show about Baroque. And this is not my first curatorial thing. This will be the 17th I do. I did one in London here with Ensor, which is insane because most of the British people don't even know Ensor, which is quite ignorant. So Ensor is also interesting because Ensor stayed British up until he was 75 years old, and up the demand of King Albert, he could become a baron, so he did the Brexit the other way around. So in that sense, it's interesting to, if you work with art, and I think it's important, if it's old master or contemporary art, but art altogether, you are working with the visual. The visual is a very interesting element when it comes to what you were trying to point out, the idea of authenticity. You can talk about all these elements, but how, and this is the language, visual is also language. I mean, it's not something we have to excuse ourselves for. I mean, it's quite interesting to see, if you think about a contemporary artist, that the contemporary artist now has to contextualize itself much more than they used to do before. I had that problem too when I started showing paintings, because I started showing paintings in a gallery that actually showed post-conceptual art. So that meant that I didn't show paintings, I made interesting images. See? And therefore, of course, I gave all the source material, I gave all the information. Then, of course, the journalist knew what to write. Now we're at the point that the journalists tell me, if the Tuymans don't talk about it, we can't write about it. So it's arrogant anyway. So when I was asked by the city of Antwerp to do a Baroque show, which of course is going to emphasize on the monster that Peter Paul Rubens is. Peter Paul Rubens is about like the first Cecil B. DeMille. It's the first filmmaker in the history of art, you can say, and the first machine also. The machine of the Counter-Reformation. It is not that I don't say he's a great painter or a great artist. He is a great artist. He was probably also the very first PR machine that existed in the idea of making a visual, but I wanted to juxtapose it. So the first idea of these people was to let me work with the now closed Museum of Fine Arts and let me work with some leftovers of their collection. I said, no, I want two premises. And the first one is the one I will get myself, and the second one is the one that the new director of this Museum of Fine Arts is getting for me. This is the one I'm going to show you that he has to get for me. The one on the far right, the cut-off head of Caravaggio, which is actually a self-portrait. And the one I got is the 5-car stud of Edward Keenholz, a work which is incredibly important, which has been actually totally vanished for about 40 to 50 years in a Japanese collection, cropped up 3 years ago, was shown again in LA MoCA in the basement, and then actually was shown in St. Louisiana in Denmark, and then in Prado, and the Prado Foundation owns this work. It is a work, when you see it, that immediately it is a sort of it's a thing that really happened in 1973. It was shown for the first time at the Documenta of Zeeman in a tent, which we are going to do in Antwerp too. We're going to recreate the very first form it was shown. And it shows the castration of an African American who had an affair with a white woman somewhere in the 70s, and the cars are lighting the scene. It is a work that immediately resonates and gives you the idea of Los Tres de Mayo and the execution painting of Goya, which is an amazing situation. Goya will also be in the show with little slats of ivory. This all combined with contemporary art. Just to say that for me, what is contemporary and what is visual are things that are very distinct, as it also is very important to understand that the making of an artwork has nothing to do with the artwork. Very important decision making and a very important conviction. Another work that is about the blasphemy of being close to power, which we have in Brussels, is David. This is the most diabolical of all artists being close to power. I mean, of course, this is totally propaganda, what you see here. It's about the size. You see it here. It's a fabulous, dangerous painting, a painting he tried to hide away, and therefore it stayed in Brussels until he died. This is important because this has to be linked with Goya and will go all the way to the French Revolution from the Baroque, because Baroque, till the 19th century, was not even an idea in the arts. It was just something which was like seen as grotesque, at the verge of burlesque. It's only at the turn of the century that it became a style in the arts. And that's why it's important to sort of riposte that. Then we go to De la Tour, which is also interesting. It all goes in the diversion and it goes against Rubens. I think it's important to do that. Then you have this sort of Ukrainian artist from the 17th century, which is insanely contemporary, if you look at it. Then another painting that will come out of the museum, and these lithographs from Onkawara, the victims of the H-bomb, which was made in my year of birth in 1958, which is an amazing situation, which will be counterparted, of course, with date paintings of a later date, but it's interesting to see how the artist also did some decision-making. Sigma Polke, de Lantella Magica, a young Belgian sculptress who makes these type of very Baroque images. Then the film of Pierre Wieck. It's a film where you see a monkey that has a no mask, and the monkey used to be trained in the region of Fukushima in a restaurant. So he brings back the monkey to the restaurant, which is still there between the rooms, put the no masks on it, and the monkey gets lost in all the situations and in the building and tries to recollect. It's a very fearful, very interesting film. A sound piece that takes up the sounds of the street from a Russian artist. An American artist who made these huge situations of hamburgers. Chinese, Zhang and Li, I mean, you can go on. Carla Rocha, Stefan Schrano, who made this like large construction that goes, that was actually in the Wallace collection, of a mirrored structure that mirrors everything and lets everything implode. Anyway, so this is the end of the slideshow. So this is what I'm actually up to, in a sense. And also, I think we should better go to the next presentation.
Thank you very much, Luke, for the fantastic presentation. Our next guest is Gilane Tawadros. I will read a few things about Gilane. Gilane Tawadros is the Chief Executive of DACS, DACS, a non-for-profit visual artists' rights management organization. Over a period of 30 years, DACS has generated over £67 million in revenues for 20,000 artists and is committed to transforming the financial landscape for visual artists. In 2016, DACS launched the DACS Foundation, a new charitable arm aimed at making a significant difference in the lives of artists and artists' estates. In particular, through Art 360, a 3-year project to develop and sustain the archives and legacies of 100 British artists and artists' estates. She was the founding director of the Institute of International Visual Arts INIVA in London, chaired by Professor Stuart Hall, which over a decade achieved an international reputation as a groundbreaking cultural agency at the leading edge of artistic and cultural debates, nationally and internationally. She has curated numerous exhibitions, including Weil New Art Gallery, Walsall, Blue Coat Art Gallery and Open Eye Gallery, Liverpool Modern Arts, Oxford's 2003, and Kulturhuset, Stockholm, 2004, Fault Lines, Venice Biennial, 2003, The Real Me, Institute of Contemporary Arts, London, 2005, Brighton Photo Biennial, 2006, and Transmission Interrupted, Modern Art, Oxford, 2010. In 2012, she was the first art historian to be appointed to the prestigious Blanche, Edith, and Irving Laurie Chair in Women's Studies, Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. She has written extensively on contemporary art. Her books include Changing States, Contemporary Arts and Ideas in an Era of Globalization, Geneva, 2004, and Life is More Important Than Art, Ostrich, 2007, which investigates the conditions for being an artist in the 21st century. An anthology of her writings, entitled The Sphinx Contemplating Napoleon, is due to be published in 2017. She was a board director and then chair of the International Foundation of Manifesta in Amsterdam, and currently serves on the boards of Film and Video Umbrella and the Stuart Croft Foundation. She sits on the editorial boards of the Whitechapel Gallery and the advisory board of the Black Artists and Modernism Research Program. She's a founding trustee and vice chair of the Stuart Hall Foundation. Please welcome Gilane Tawadros.
Thank you. Thank you. So I was checking my slides before I came this afternoon, just as well I did, because I'd written the subtitle as Cultural Identity, Escape and Authenticity. So you can read into that what you will. Okay, so about 10 years ago, I interviewed a number of artists for a book project. The book was called Life is More Important Than Art, and the title comes from a quote from the African-American novelist James Baldwin, who once said that life is more important than art, that's why art is important. And I think that sentence for me expresses very eloquently Baldwin's insight into the dynamic and contingent relationship between art and everyday life. Life is more important than art in the sense that we need food, water, shelter, clothing, and other things to subsist. But if that is all we have, then we're simply surviving and not living. Art is important, according to Baldwin, precisely because it's not a functional necessity. Life is more important than art, but art is important because it operates in an adjacent but different, even marginal sphere to everyday life. The book was an attempt to understand the slippery zone between art and everyday life. What does it mean to be an artist in the 21st century? What role, if any, does the artist play in mediating or translating the world around them? One of the artists I interviewed for the book was the Filipino-born artist David Medulla. And reflecting on the role of art as a kind of imaginative alchemy, David spoke to me about Kazimir Malevich's Black Square on White. Apparently, said David, when he was a boy, he used to watch his parents heat some black molasses, and he would be amazed when it turned into white sugar. That really enchanted him, and he couldn't figure it out. He thought either his parents were magicians or they had a special gift. And then he realized it's the heat, that transforms it. And that, of course, it came from the sun. That's why his first non-objective painting he called Hymn to the Sun. And people were wondering why. I mean, it's a black square on white. And when I first saw it, I said, something's wrong, maybe a new translation, you know, because I thought maybe the black square was the black night against all the different white. I think for David Medulla, it's the transformative imagination of the artist which is key, which converts reality in everyday life into something special and distinctive. In the 1915 exhibition in St. Petersburg, when it was first shown, the black square was hung tilted across the corner of a room like an icon in the devotional corner of a Russian peasant's house. It's difficult not to read this painting as marking a break or fracture, a break between Tsarist Russia and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which would emerge in the wake of the Bolshevik Revolution, but also a fissure between the religious iconography of the Russian Orthodox Church and the language of modern painting. But most importantly of all, perhaps, a break from the painting of things, that's to say the representation of the world, to the activity of painting as an end in itself. In his 1927 book, The Non-Objective World, Malevich wrote, "In the year 1913, trying desperately to free art from the date weight of the real world, I took refuge in the form of the square." So I was thinking when Georgios invited me to talk today with Luke, where should art sit in relation to the real world? And where, if at all, should artists take refuge? In the intervening decades since the book Life is More Important Than Art was published, the world looks and feels very different. We're living through a period of rapid and momentous change, perhaps not revolutionary change, as in the first decades of the 20th century in Russia, but in the last 12 to 18 months there's been a sense, certainly in Europe and the United States, that there's been an acceleration, an intensification and depth to the changes in political and social discourse, which some find exciting and liberating, and others find ominous and disturbing. I want to explore what it means to be an artist at this particular historical conjuncture. What role, if any, does the artist have at this time of social, economic, and political turbulence? The shift in social and political discourse has been punctuated by a sequence of events which seem to be indications of more systematic and even seismic shifts in our social and political reality. The shootings in Orlando, the attacks in Paris, Brussels, Nice, Berlin, London and elsewhere, the assassination here in Britain of Joe Cox MP, the Brexit referendum vote, and the election of Donald Trump in the US. Although these are very different events, with different actors and locations, they've all been framed by questions of race, nation, and identity. More specifically, they raise the question of living, or rather not living, with difference. Perhaps one of the most tangible effects of the current historical conjuncture is the overriding sense of fissure, not only in terms of a break in the cultural consensus, but equally of a divide between different communities and constituencies. In the same year that the book Life is More Important Than Art was published, the artist Doris Salcedo performed a rupture in the physical fabric of Tate Modern's Turbine Hall, a fissure which cut through the floor of the space, revealing a fault line in the very foundation of the museum. She called it shibboleth. The word shibboleth, as I'm sure you know, refers back to an incident in the Bible which describes how the Ephraimites, attempting to flee across the river Jordan, were stopped by their enemies, the Glidadites. As their dialect did not include a sh sound, those who could not say the word shibboleth were captured and executed. Talking about this work, Salcedo said, "Shibboleth is a piece that refers to dangers at crossing borders or to being rejected in the moment of crossing borders. The presence of the immigrant is always unwelcome. The presence of the immigrant is seen as jeopardizing the culture of Europe. Europe has been seen as a homogeneous society, a democratic society, that has learnt through centuries of development, has learnt to resolve issues through dialogue. And if that is the case, then where do we place these outbreaks of racial hatred? 10 years on, Salcedo's piece seems to have anticipated the new fissures which have opened up in different societies and nation-states across the world. The illusory notion that Europe had settled comfortably into a post-war consensus has given way to the realization that this apparent consensus only masked huge economic and social inequities and disparities, which have been getting greater every day. The Brexit referendum and the uncompromising and violent political rhetoric which has surrounded it has been experienced by many as an abrupt rupture, particularly in those urban conurbations of England, where in the period after the Second World War, racial and cultural difference have become embedded into the fabric of those cities. A narrative has been unfolding over recent years, which first of all sets to one side the uncomfortable conclusion of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, namely that systemic institutional racism exists in the police force and was the reason why, following the brutal murder of a young black architecture student, the police failed to bring his killers to justice for several years. Then, over the following years, we've seen multiculturalism disparaged as a symptom of what is derisively called political correctness. Now the binary separation between the good immigrant and the bad refugee has given way to a new chapter which entrenches a hierarchy of difference and makes summary judgment about British strangers. British strangers, I've just made up, is a term I've adapted from an unsettling description that I heard the Dutch Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, use during the recent elections in Holland when he described Dutch citizens of Moroccan descent as Dutch strangers. According to this differentiation, there are the good strangers who are employed, conform to so-called British values and can be assimilated into Britishness, while on the other hand there are those without work who manifest their difference overtly and appear to resist assimilation into the wider culture and society. In the post-war years, British cities like Birmingham, Manchester, Leicester and London saw a continuous influx of migrants from the former British Empire. London in particular has acted as a magnet for artists arriving in Britain from elsewhere. In the immediate post-war years, there were consecutive waves of artists from Commonwealth countries coming to London to study or practice, mainly from Africa, Asia and the Caribbean, including artists such as Aubrey Williams and Frank Bowling. An artist like David Medulla, who established the gallery and magazine Signals in the mid-1960s, and Rashida Raeen, who established a number of publications, most famously Third Text, which he set up in the early 80s. During that decade, Britain saw the emergence of a new generation of artists, writers and intellectuals, born and brought up in the UK, but who came from different cultural backgrounds and who developed new ideas and practices which would have profound effects upon British culture as a whole. In 1980s Britain, the idea of a settled, homogenous, mainstream identity that could be easily invoked for the nation and society was being challenged by a number of wholly different artists, musicians, writers, and filmmakers, from Derek Jarman's dystopian vision of the future in Jubilee through to Stephen Frear's more celebratory depiction of multiracial, multisexual Britain in My Beautiful Laundrette. The decade of the late 70s to late 80s marked a radical shift in the social and urban fabric of Britain, for which London was the centre stage. The Sex Pistols' irreverent reworking of the national anthem, God Save the Queen, The Clash's London Calling, were the discordant tunes of a changing society where the rhetoric of one nation, Britain, had become fractured. At the same time, as conflicts were erupting on the streets of the metropolis, London was forging a new identity, which was to become synonymous with the multiple identities of its inhabitants and their interrelationships. Articulating a spectrum of new social, cultural and artistic connections which crisscrossed the city and transgressed racial boundaries, London's creative heterogeneity and cultural miscegenation found form not only in the novels of Hanif Qureshi and the songs of The Clash, but also in the works of a new generation of black artists, writers and filmmakers. This new generation was contesting the settled image of Britain as a monocultural society, and the capital was frequently the focal for cultural and political struggles to redefine Britishness and British culture. The family of the artist Zarina Bimji was among thousands of Ugandan Asian families who arrived in Britain in the 1970s, having been expelled by Idi Amin, who gave his country's Asian community 90 days to pack up and leave. These works by Zarina, which relate to her monumental film Out of Blue, address the experience of forced exile and its residues in a poetic and elliptical way. The works are almost an anti-archive, in the sense that they don't elicit any factual information from what has happened in the past, or organize the past into any ordered, meaningful way. Rather, these haunting, melancholic images speak of cataclysmic effects that appear to have been forgotten or neglected. Bimji's described the works as being concerned with learning to listen to difference, the difference in shadows, microcosms, and sensitivity to difference in its various forms, listening with the eyes, listening to changes in tone, difference in colour. It's about, she said, making sense through the medium of aesthetics. At this particular social and political moment, it's not just those artists and intellectuals who've been dislocated from their countries of origin and birth to Europe who are having to come to terms with the double turn of exit exile, which Adil Abd Salam playfully invoked. As the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish has written, exile is more than a geographical concept. You can be an exile in your own homeland, in your own house, in a room. A pervasive anxiety grips indigenous communities in Britain, France, Germany, Greece and elsewhere. Those who have been cast adrift by the forces of globalization and neoliberal economics feel alienated and disenfranchised in their own homes. In response, they turn nostalgically to an idea of a homogeneous national identity which has probably never existed, and turn against those whom they consider to be strangers in their midst. In his Reith Lectures in 1993, Edward Said cites Baldwin and Malcolm X as his inspirational models of what it means to be an intellectual. The challenge of an intellectual life, he says, is to be found in the dissent against the status quo at a time when the struggle on behalf of unrepresented and disadvantaged groups seems so unfairly weighted against them. For Said, the condition of exile is an enabling rather than a disabling one. The condition of marginality which accompanies exile frees the intellectual from having to proceed with caution or be afraid to overturn the apple cart. To be as marginal and as domesticated as someone who is in real exile, says Said, is for an intellectual to be unusually responsive to the traveller rather than to the potentate, to the provincial and risky rather than to the habitual, to innovation and experiment rather than the authoritatively given status quo. The exilic intellectual does not respond to the logic of the conventional, but to the audacity of daring, to representing change, to moving on, not standing still. The process of making artworks presents the opportunity for a radically different model of inquiry that, unlike science, religion, politics, and many other fields of our intellectual and social lives, contemporary artistic practice is concerned with asking questions about the world around us rather than offering up answers. Because until we understand fully the questions that we're asking in a profound, critical, self-reflexive way, then we're unlikely to find the right answers. If, following Zarina Bimji, we think of artistic practice as a process of making sense through aesthetics, then perhaps the challenge and opportunity of the current conjuncture is for artists and intellectuals to embrace fully the conditions of marginality and exile, and in doing so, to challenge the status quo, to take risks, to innovate and experiment, to move on, and most importantly of all, to imagine a different future to the present in which we find ourselves, and thereby transform it. Thank you.
The first question for Gilane. You spoke about Malevich and the retrieve in the Black Square, and also about exile. And I wanted to ask you if the making of art is this sense of a positive exile, a refuge to retrieve, and also I wrote down the audacity of daring. If there is this construction of an exile created through which the artistic practice develops. Yes, this is the question.
I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but to go back to your original, you started off introducing us talking about Antigone.
Yes.
As this figure, who's so symbolic of European democracy and rights. But for me, Antigone is far less interesting than Medea. And Medea, for me, is the figure that's denied citizenship. She doesn't choose to reject it, which is the privilege of Antigone as a citizen to do that. She can't do that. But Medea is also the problematic figure for me. She's very hard to like. She's not an easily assimilable figure. And I guess that's what I was trying to say, and taking my cue from Edward Said, that it's in that zone of marginality and unassimilatableness that it's possible to think differently, and that there is potentially a analogy between that zone of marginality and exile and the activity of being an artist. But perhaps that's something you should address to Luke.
Well, first of all, I think becoming an artist, as a concept, I think something that happens later, I also think. But when it happens, it is also quite a conviction. It is also a choice. And it mostly starts with this, and that's what's quite interesting, with a sort of self-chosen idea of isolation. Later on, when the work becomes more known, there is another form of isolation, which is public isolation. I think that is an interesting part where the artist becomes not only known, but also professional. So for me, it has always been a big understanding from the minute you show your work publicly, that is the point where you lose your innocence. I don't know, because we were talking about this idea of authenticity. It's a very difficult item in a sense, because it is very difficult to wrap that up also.
I'm interested in the isolation, in the way an
that is also a privilege, in a sense, that you, there is, for example, the point when I was teaching at the Rijksacademie in Amsterdam, there were two people from Benin that actually, firstly nearly stole a video camera, and then went to film the grandfather in the village. And all of a sudden, it changed from blue and red, so it was not very well done. So I asked them, is this deliberate? And the guy goes, yeah, it is. But you didn't go further, and I want to go further into it. And then he said, well, it's really weird, when we see you people here, you go to your studio, close yourself up, we start to talk with the people, and out of this sort of conversation. I said, yes, but this is also an overpopulated situation, so it is a privilege to be alone in one place.
It is a privilege, but I personally believe it's practically very difficult. This isolation and the exile might sound romantic, but at the same time, regarding paying your bills and doing things that the whole of the society regards as something rational, it's quite difficult. For instance, if I might spend a whole day in the studio looking at my images. This is a part of my work. If I say it to anyone outside the art world, they simply think I'm crazy. It sounds romantic, it sounds nice, but at the same time, it comes with a difficulty, and it is a decision, and the decision has I forgot the words. The decision has responsibility. But look, you often talk about a hell for the first 3 hours in the studio.
About hell, yeah.
Yeah, and you are very precise about these words. And has this to do perhaps with the necessity of perhaps an isolation or a different rhythm?
No, it has to do with nervousness. I think it's very important for me to still be nervous after a practice of nearly 35 years of painting. Luckily I am. I mean, that's also part of the joy, which is, and I don't want to go into romanticizing the artist, because if there's one thing I don't want to do is romanticize that. I do want to see it, though, as a profession in a way. And it has been denounced to be a profession for the longest time, although it is, in a sense. It's actually a conviction that runs 24 hours on 24 hours, and it is not just a choice, it's your fucking life. And therefore, when they made a documentary about it in the national television in Belgium, I said to the documentary makers, we're not going to make one joke. It's all going to be serious. And the cab drivers, I take 3 cabs a day, that drive me at night, and the ones that drive me at night taped it. The ones that drive me through the day saw it, and they said, we didn't know that. This is important, that you show that it is a job, that it's a way that you think, it's a way that you actually make an assessment of a reality, and that you also are as generous, because generosity is the main key element in culture. Without generosity, there is nothing. So, and that's the generosity you give in, but it's also quite an assessment, I mean, to make as a person and as an individual, because it also has individual strengths. So it also has a value system that is different from an existing value system, which I think is important. I mean, there's this one poet, and I never forgot that, because I saw as a little kid when I was going to my family in Amsterdam, there is and I don't know if it's still there, on an apartment building from Lucebert, there's everything of value is valueless. It's a beautiful statement. So, and that's exactly what it's about. The fact that you always have to come up with an excuse is the worst possible nightmare. And this happens the whole time. Last week I was interviewed because of the project in Borglone, and the interviewer, who was, of course, journalists nowadays, most of the old journalists that used to write about culture died off or went on a pension. Now they have to have an excuse. It's about money, it's about this. And then they will talk maybe about culture. And I got really mad about that. Because why do you always need an excuse? Why do you always underestimate people?
Getting in the margin in a way. Gilane, it was very interesting to hear you talking and see the interplay at the same time with the images. And then there were these blank images with the titles as raptures in this narrative. Break, Brexit, exit, exile, a rapture, and is this a rapture we're living now? We are now living in with all the recent political things that's going on, like Brexit or Trump or yes.
I think it is a rupture. I think it's a rupture, but it's a rupture which we've experienced the force of in a very condensed period of time, but which has been building up for probably decades to this moment. So I don't think it just came from nowhere, but I think it's almost like a pressure cooker of things that have been accumulating over a period of time until it kind of has. And I think there is a fissure. I think there is a break, and determinedly so. I mean, that's how the populist nationalism that's being articulated at the moment is being presented as a break and a fissure with what's gone before, and intentionally so.
And it is a rupture that perhaps has to do with the notion of a cultural identity. What came in my mind was an article of yours I read on The Guardian a few months ago about, I think the title was "I Fear Tolerance, Britain is Lost," if I'm not mistaken. And so this idea of because I feel a rupture in this sense of identity, in contrast to something like the glocal that you mentioned and we spoke outside, a link between the local and the global. Let's say this words play global. I'm sorry, and I feel a rupture there, and that things are slightly feel as they are slightly closing again somehow.
Yeah, I mean, you could talk about a minority group, and in a sense, culture could be the next minority group. And in that sense, you're actually fighting for your survival. And I think that is the element of resistance, which is an entity within culture as itself. And that's important. If that happens on a local, on a global level, it's important to take that stance and to take that type of responsibility, that type of activism also, if you like. Because, of course, culture has no boundaries, has no frontiers, basically. Never had, in a sense. And this has been ongoing, I mean, since we know it, in a sense. And this can be, I mean, the most important people in when the countries were still like the Comecon states under Soviet Union reign, were actually the writers, the dissidents, the people that brought out the ideas. So there is always a specificity to what one can do. And I think that is quite a responsibility and an interesting point to see how you deal with that. Also to see how the world has changed, because it's quite interesting that to think about the idea that the internet, when it came out, was the idea that would open up the world. We didn't know, some of the Americans actually thought we didn't need politics anymore because it was all on the web. Of course, they forgot that these things are controlled and people make money on this. And now you can see, and if you look at Trump's election, and Obama did that too, but how the social media played into that, or how the deep web is actually distorting realities, how we are talking about fake news, how the Damien Hirst show is the post-truth show now, which is all the bombastic situation that is going on. But those are interesting phenomenons, and I think it is important to, in terms of an element of integrity, and this is solely an individual stance, you can make a distinction. That distinction is wordful. It's important to do that.
If there's something that I'm quite interested in when you were talking, Luke, earlier, talking about your painting, is the relationship between painting and representation now. How has that changed in a way? Does sense, can we say that painting becomes more important at a moment when we have a enhanced sense of representation being such a slippery and unreliable thing?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the one thing I give you an interesting example is that painting is a medium, because also in your text you talk about the idea that the medium is sort of like taking over. Or
yes,
which I found a very interesting, kind of devious statement, but it's an interesting statement that you make that statement, but I think painting itself is something that works through time, with time, and over time. It is a very slow idea, and it's also an anachronism, which I think one should not forget. And in that sense, it has the chance to play on your memory that is already inadequate. So there was this one director from the Museum of Contemporary Art in Honolulu that hated my work. And when he went to look at the Tate Modern show, which was a sort of overview or survey, he hated it even more. But then he started to dream of it, became my biggest fan. So that means that as you have the deep web, you have that also in imagery. The fact that the painting is painted physically by somebody makes it very difficult to completely remember it, because it's so extremely detailed that you cannot encompass that memory as an image. That inadequacy is actually part of the visual and is part of that painting. And in that sense, whenever somebody asks me the question, they ask me numerous times, because there's been this discourse about painting being dead or alive for decades now, which I think is a hollowed out discourse. Also the misunderstanding of Duchamp. Duchamp was trying to make a masterpiece in the end with his big glass. So in a sense, that's not a discussion anymore. I think that's not really a point of departure. Therefore, my answer would always be, I paint because I'm not naive. Because, I mean, the painted image is the first conceptual image, be it on a cave, be it anywhere else. You can print an image, but you can paint far quicker and faster, and without the resonance of dimensions. So it is quite a particular point. So the medium is something, and every medium has its specificities, and every medium can have a specific purpose. I think you have to look at mediums like that. And therefore to say that the medium is overriding you is quite a harsh statement.
Or threatening somehow. It's one of the arguments of the, let's say, linguistic revolution, that you're not using language, but the language uses you. Through this, I see the image being threatening me somehow, using me, or at least or the making of it seems to take the form of an encounter with it. But by hearing you talking about images and representation, the imagery you use, the images you use, one feels that there is, well, you also talk about it often, but there is a research there, that there is research undertaken, yes, and they feel critical, they feel very conscious, the decisions and the imagery in your work. Yet at the same time, you often talk about the memory of the hand, the memory of the hand,
yeah,
and which is also related closely to the medium of painting, the materiality, and which creates a very interesting balance for me between hand and mind, between the conscious decisions, but at the same time letting painting do the job, let's say.
But I think I make a painting in a day. So why is that? It just grew on me like that. It's not something that I set out as a concept to do. It maybe has to do with my limitations of my attention span. But I do a lot of work before I start even making a painting. I think a lot about it, make a lot of drawings, use everything that I can use in the toolbox to use. But once it comes to making the painting, I don't want to think anymore. The intelligence goes to your hand. And that is an element of timing and precision and intentionality. And this can also be physical. This is a physical sort of intelligence. And you have to let that happen, in a sense. Therefore, the very 3-4 first hours, of course, hell, because it's then when it has to make the transition. And it's a bodily transition. And I also am not going to go as far as that I am my work and my work is me, because I don't believe in that. I mean, that's not true at all. I mean, what I also advise to everybody is to create a style. Your handwriting changes throughout your age. You should let the handwriting and the way you paint is also something that changes. You cannot go back. I mean, I could sort of like technically remake what I made before, but intentionally I cannot. And you will actually see that. I'm sure people will see that, or feel it at least. You can also feel an image, basically.
Maybe it's time to open the discussion to the audience for questions.
Hello, thank you very much it was fantastic. I would like to connect the two of the presentations because, look, actually you, Gilane, were talking about life and art and how life is more important than art. And then you were talking about basically you are an artist, but at one point it becomes a profession, but you can't stop it. It's 24/7. And then you were talking about that at one point, when you open it to the public, when you show it to the public, you lose a sense of innocence. And for me, I want to ask, when there is an issue that you feel really passionately about as a person, but you want to comment on it as an artist, where did you ever have to tell yourself, like, okay, I need to step back now, that this is taking over myself too much, and then also with this innocence, there must have come a sense of vulnerability, possibly, and maybe ask, what do you think about vulnerability in resistance or as resistance?
I think the same way as I think about torture, violence and tenderness. It's the most imminent torture you can think of. And I think there are things that you censor in a way. I mean, I did that constantly. Before I actually even showed my work, I had censored it. So that means that I destroyed things that I didn't want anybody to see. That is my censorship, which is, of course, limited in a sense. But it is also a privilege to be able to do that. On the other hand, I think an artwork should always be multi-layered, which is really important. I mean, the one-to-one or the so-called visceral sort of artwork, there's a lot of that. There was a lot of that in London. So I think for me a little bit too weak. I mean, it's doesn't have enough flesh to it. I think it's important that that an artwork, first of all, doesn't go into propaganda, because that also is one of the dangers that lies ahead. And there are, of course, works that then it becomes, for me, it becomes too one-sided in a sense, and that is the one thing I'm afraid of, as I'm also afraid of going over the contrast of an image.
Just on the point of vulnerability, I think actually at this particular moment, vulnerability is really important. I think one of the questions I've been thinking about is how you address and how you respond to the violence and the kind of the very strutting kind of power of this moment, and whether you try and face it with the same kind of hardness and briskness and strength, but whether actually perhaps to face it with vulnerability is more difficult, but maybe ultimately more powerful. But it's a really difficult one because
it kind of needs, it feels so present, and so that like the response needs to be really quick and right now. But if it's as you say, slow and vulnerable, it often doesn't have that. Maybe it needs more time. Also, like with your paintings and multi-layeredness, that sometimes it doesn't. And what you were talking about, your biggest fan, that you're about your biggest fan now, that he didn't like your paintings, but it came only through repeated viewings that it sank in.
Yeah, I also think the idea of vulnerability is an important element in terms that you can co-opt it in a sense. You can make it into something very, very powerful. But then it has to be used, and in a very powerful way also. And I also don't say that work doesn't have a political stance. An artwork can have a political stance at a certain given moment in time, but you cannot upload a work of art with a political stance, because then life is actually politics. So art is not life also. You have to understand the distinction between the two, which I think are important parameters to just make, like, for example, when I did a show in Heimat in 1995, which was a show about Flemish nationalism in my hometown, which was like right-wing, like totally right-wing, xenophobe national. I did it out of disgust, because 1 out of 3 people in Antwerp voted for this fucking party. So would I show this show in New York? Of course not, because it doesn't make sense. It would be folkloric. Years later, whereas one of the images was an image that I wanted to paint because I wanted to paint all the symbols they wanted to get away from, was the Flemish flag, which I actually first painted a watercolor, then cramped it together, pinned it on the wall, and made a Polaroid of it, which muted the color, took the color down, actually, like in a mist. The same painting, when reshown, coming from a touring show in 4 American museums in Brussels, and the day of the opening, and this was also because you have to understand that our country is cut in half, which means the northern part is actually the center right, and sometimes far right, and the southern part is the socialist part, which is and in the middle you have Brussels, a bit like Washington. And so, in that sense, when my show opened in Brussels, that was the day that the Belgian government actually broke the world record of not being with the government. So from day one, that show was politicized. From day one, that particular painting that was in the show, yet again, since it reappeared in the masses, got a different stance. So this is the power of things that are reoccurrent and are coming back. That's what I also wanted to say with the Baroque situation. I mean, the fact that this work of Kino's was disappeared for 40 years, and when it then actually was shown, actually in so-called much more liberalized America, still in the MoCA, LA MoCA, it was shown in the basement. It's important that these things resonate, and it's not going to get better; it's going to get worse, basically. So this is the stance you can make, and I mean, and if the thing I do is like when I'm not going to paint Trump with a little dick, it's not going to work. They did that already. So you have to go further into the system, deeper into the system. I think that's what culture has to do. It has to investigate the situation.
And any making of an artwork seems to be a gesture for me. And the making of an artwork is a gesture towards the world, is a stance, as you said. This is something, well, your comment before is also a personal concern of mine, because at the same time I'm concerned with politics and with questions as the ones I presented. I feel, what am I doing here? I'm doing small abstract paintings. And is it a paradox? I think that it's this gesture which interests me. And especially today, I feel that the use of a very subtle and poetic language can be not a statement, but a political act somehow. Yes.
Hello. I wanted to go back to vulnerability, and I wanted to kind of raise again, because I heard a few statements on isolation, it as being something of a privilege. I don't know if, speaking of a cultural isolation, there is no way I could ever consider it being a privilege. I think anybody who moved from one place, from one cultural kind of background to another, would feel the pain and the marginalization and the break and the kind of the exit of isolation in many, many levels. And speaking of language, it's a good example of language using you as the other way around. Especially thinking of Belgium, who's got culturally very difficult already kind of roots as a nation, because you can't talk about cultural identity and not mix it with national identity, because especially now, with recent kind of development in political life, they're very much linked again. We hoped they were not, but appears that they still are, and the link grows stronger and stronger. So national identity is in the rise, and to me it's very alarming and very, very difficult kind of society to deal with. And speaking of Belgium, as I've been, I moved to Belgium a few years ago. I've got two nationalities, Russian and Belgian, and I went through kind of all the kind of political, social, and cultural ways of integrating into Belgium, and I felt on my own skin the kind of the institutionalized way of integrating which every person who arrives to Belgium has to go through. And isolation is not a privilege. Isolation is a pain, is a suffering, is something which you wish you didn't have to go through. So I would like you to comment on this Belgian artist from Belgian roots who never moved out of Belgium, who always stayed in Belgium. How is that possible, you consider isolation from that perspective? Thank you. To Luc, of course.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, of course, you're right. I mean, I was born in Antwerp, and I didn't move. I mean, I still live in Antwerp. If you would compare that with my wife, who's also an artist in her own right, she moved from Caracas to Chicago, from Chicago to Antwerp, from two major cities with much more major populations than, let's say, the small town of Antwerp. And of course, if you use isolation out of your own experience, that is rightfully so. I mean, the isolation I was dealing up to is in terms of the privilege is the one you choose. I mean, so the one by moving, of course, you put yourself in a different perspective. That is for sure. Now, should I then also move to another country, whereas I can actually easily travel, which is also another privilege, from my country to any other country, or from my city to any other city. So, I mean, I'm not really a total believer in the fact that moving to another place would immediately enhance different experiences. It could, and it could not. That is an open question. So I think you have to see that also in the perspective of the choice that you make. I think that's more how I meant it. I mean, I didn't mean it as a sort of moral thing or a thing that has this sort of as a byproduct create all the troubles that come with it. No, that is something I put it in a different perspective.
Well, in Belgium also, because of the geographical location, you feel that
and anyway,
you're in the center of everywhere.
Belgium's never been a country. I mean, it's a region. It's founded by the Rothschilds, who pays for it. After the Napoleonic Wars, it was given back to the Netherlands. The king didn't want to be king of it because he wanted everybody to be Protestant, which couldn't be because the upper class was French-speaking and everybody was Catholic, so he just left. And that's how Belgium came about in 1830. It's one of the youngest countries on the globe, basically. And luckily, we don't really have a national feeling because we can't. I mean, that's really an interesting point. So it's like a non-space already. It's like, I don't say it's Disneyland, but it's quite interesting. And it was created as a buffer between big states. And
I remember last year Jan Fabric did a presentation in Athens, and he began with the national team of Belgium, the football national team of Belgium, and he said, I want to talk to you about my country. And then the second thing he mentioned was that all of the players were from Belgians, but from different countries, different origins, which I found very interesting. Perhaps the last question.
Thank you. I'm a painter, and I've listened to the presentations, and then I've been trying to keep really quiet and just listen, but we're in 2017, and I'm sitting here and I look around and I'm just like, what's going on? And when we talk about art, when we talk about cultural identity, it's not a clear thing, it's really complex. And there are people who are in this country who are blended, who are a mixture of heritage, a mixture of culture, who are still on the peripheries, still marginal. And those are really current things that are really concerning, that people who are born here, whose grandparents were born here, are still seen as marginal and are not at the centre. And if cultural identity is something that we pursue, and particularly as people who produce art, we need to do a lot more to work together so that we become a force to do something with, because it's still the same old story for me, looking around, not just here, but where I've studied as well. And we're in London, and I just think the potential to do more and to stand up against all these changes, these challenges, is an imperative that we have to deal with. Sorry, that wasn't a question.
Gilane, maybe if you want to comment on that, I don't know.
It was a comment, and I think you're right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's absolutely right. But I think what I fear is that this current political moment is, and that's why I tried to talk about, a history of the city, of how artists have there's been this constant flux and flow of difference which has been generative. It's produced culture, it's changed the culture. That my fear is that there is going to be a greater and greater drive to eclipse that difference, even though it's not at the centre. It's only inching slightly from the margins. So I think that's an even bigger reason for us to think about difference as a creative, generative force.
Yeah, I also think what is important is actually the idea of quality also. One of my good friends is Kerry James Marshall, which I think is a great painter. If he's a black great painter, he's a great painter. I think that is an important thing to say. That's also what Kerry James is telling us, in a sense, having diluted the idea of art history, I mean, and the image of the black people in the history, which is his fight, and it's a legitimate fight that he's been doing for the last 30 years. Now, it's very funny. He gets his retrospective in the United States. I went especially to see a show in the Breuer because it's like a brutalist building, which is an epic show. And then you have Trump. So, I mean, it is as if reality overholds you. I mean, keeps on coming. This is the big fear I have. It's coming all the time, all the time. The problem is that you cannot. It's very difficult to fight stupidity. It really is, and it has been proven through history that is the biggest fight. It's an educational fight, and it's also a culture fight. And I think we should, in the future, emphasize on that type of fight, because that's where you create not only a new generation, but a new culture, basically. And that culture has to be global and multicultural. It cannot be otherwise. But of course, before we go there, we'll have to go somewhere else.
Thank you very much, and thanks for being here.